For this last conference session, which is the closest we get really to a fireside chat at Symposium, we want to talk about conspiracy and conspiracy theories. More importantly, we want to go beyond the usual stale binary conversation, you know, we're all fact-checking great, they're all idiots, to try and say something more interesting and more relevant to the work of real investigative journalism. To do this, we are delighted to have a profoundly international panel, two journalists who've flown in from Hong Kong and Copenhagen, respectively, to join us and talk about their controversial investigations. First of all, Florence de Changy is a foreign correspondent currently based in Hong Kong for Le Monde and RFI, who's been covering the Asia-Pacific region since the early 1990s. But since 2014, she's also been investigating the loss of Malaysia Airlines flight MH370, about which she published her book, The Disappearing Act, which sharply challenged the official story of what happened to it. Mads Brugger, on the other hand, is an award-winning Danish filmmaker known for his unorthodox, sometimes comedic, approach to exposing corruption and malfeasance. His approach has sometimes been called a hybrid of investigative journalism and performance art. The reason why he's here is because of his 2019 documentary, Cold Case Hammarskjöld, which deals with the death of Dag Hammarskjöld in 1961, when the UN Secretary General's plane mysteriously crashed in the Congo. So first of all, without further ado, let's talk briefly about their investigations. Florence, perhaps you could start by telling us, both of these investigations will be utterly fascinating to us, even if we don't agree with the conclusions of our journalists. But perhaps we could start by asking you how you came to MH370 and what you found out.
Yeah. Is it worth reminding in a few words what the story is, MH370? Yes. I guess. MH370 is the flight number of Boeing 777, which was flying on a daily route between Kuala Lumpur and Beijing. And that flight, now we call MH370, referring to that final and catastrophic flight, took off from Kuala Lumpur and disappeared after 40 minutes. It was carrying 239 people and 10 tons of cargo. So 40 minutes after the flight, no news. And the official narrative that very quickly sprung up was that actually the flight did an incredible U-turn, so went back westbound, then went up the Malacca Strait, and even if you're not familiar with the geography, it's basically an impossible letter. It's not a Z, it's a T, whatever. Up the Malacca Strait, rounded Indonesia, and then a ghost flight to the southern Indian Ocean, where it crashed and where it was never found. That is the official narrative of the story. And briefly, how I come to cover it is very basic. It's just that my newspaper, Le Monde, after 1 week of the plane having disappeared, decided that this is actually not just a normal plane accident. And because I had been based in Kuala Lumpur a few years before, they thought, and because my Bangkok, the correspondent who was supposed to cover Malaysia at the time, based in Bangkok, was not available, they thought, let's send Florence and cover the story. That was my first step in the story.
Can you tell us something about sources?
All right.
Move on to Mads.
Yeah, sure. Well, that story, maybe then I can tell you how it evolved into a bigger story, because, the first week or the first few days of investigation in Kuala Lumpur was pretty normal. Like, I would try and go to the daily press conference, which is actually a circus every day at 5 p.m. But I had already decided that I would actually stay in town because the story was so big. I mean, it was the same crowd of journalists flown in from around the world that you would have for an Olympic game or something. It was literally hundreds of us, and these press conferences were chaos. And so at the beginning, I just did the normal work a journalist dispatched on a hot story would do, covering what was coming out every day and just observing the nonsense and the contradictions and the fact that the Malaysians were completely at loss. But I must say, I was also at the same time seeing my good old sources trying to catch something else. But after one week, I just left Kuala Lumpur with the official story. Like, they told us that, finally, they may have seen some wreckage in the Southern Indian Ocean. So that's okay. As a journalist, I don't start with a question. I mean, as a mainstream media journalist, I don't start by questioning the official narrative and everyone seemed to gather on things. But as you said, talking about sources, I already had seen and talked to quite a few sources local sources whom I knew from my years, like almost 20 years before when I was based in Malaysia. And they gave me hints. And it's like they plant seeds in your brain that eventually, when you revisit the story, they have grown in the meantime.
People will want to know briefly what you found out. Briefly.
Okay, briefly, the official narrative that I just described, that the plane crashed in the Southern Indian Ocean, is a complete fabrication. It is a lie. It is a sophisticated, but not so sophisticated, actually, lie.
So what happened?
The search in Australia was a massive diversion. And that's why my book is called The Disappearing Act, because in any disappearance, you need a diversion. If you want to move something away, you need a noise right there, so everyone watches there while you think it's taken away. So that, in short, is the blunt of what I found, that the whole story, which keeps being repeated, by the way, like every 3 to 6 months. So there is a real machine behind that. It's fascinating to study and to look at closely. But essentially, the story that the plane crashed in the Southern Indian Ocean, including the so-called debris that they eventually found kilometers away from the crash site, is fabricated. And it is very difficult, as you can all imagine, for me, a mainstream journalist working with institutions like Le Monde or RFI, to say such things.
But what's your best guess, briefly, on what happened?
It is, I developed, because it was under the pressure of my publisher, HarperCollins, here in London. They really wanted to write my best guess, and as journalists, we don't like to do that. But with everything I had, because there is plenty of evidence coming from the real sources, the documents, the official documents, and the secret documents, I came to the idea that to the conclusion that the plane met its fate, and I don't want to be more precise than that, within 1 hour of when it disappeared from the air traffic controller radars. And it happened, basically, whatever happened, and of course, I have many more elements to that, happened very shortly and happened in Asia. But it's very difficult. And I would like to say I'm still working on the investigation, and I'm still receiving information. And I want to be very cautious about what I say.
Fair enough. Mads, your conclusions, just like Florence's, are controversial, to say the least. Your documentary, I think some people have likened it to the very definition of going down rabbit holes, of going where your curiosity takes you. Can you tell us what interested you first about the case of Dag Hammarskjöld, and what briefly you concluded or found out?
Yes. Initially, I knew very little about Dag Hammarskjöld. What got me going was a small article in The Guardian about this elderly, very nerdy and gentle Swedish private investigator named Jörn Björkdal, who had gone to Zambia, where Hammarskjöld's plane crashed in 1961 at Ndola. And there he had tracked down the black witnesses from back then, most of them being charcoal burners. And back then, no one spoke to these people because only white people could be taken seriously as witnesses. And there was a huge discrepancy between what they told Göran Björkdal and what the official version was. And I thought initially, how very interesting. So I teamed up with Göran Björkdal and thus began a 7-year-long journey. And quite soon I discovered that there are several schools within Dag Hammarskjöld conspiracy theory. It's a conspiracy theory for senior citizens, especially Swedish senior citizens, Hammarskjöld being Swedish. And it's also a conspiracy theory which appeals enormously to people on the left. It's a bit like 4chan for liberals. Later on, I discovered that there's actually a conspiracy theory within the conspiracy theory, which has to do with a weird, mysterious entity known as the South African Institute for Maritime Research, in short, CIMAR. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa closed down in 1998, they had a press meeting, and at that meeting, Desmond Tutu released a set of documents which had been discovered by researchers stemming from this weird group. Some said it was a front for South African intelligence, which contains the script for killing Hammarskjöld. And ever since, there has been a lot of guessing going on about, well, what is this CIMAR and who was behind it. I do say in the film initially that this could probably be the most idiotic conspiracy theory ever told. And I do go down the rabbit hole and end up... I became obsessed with this CIMAR, and especially the now dead commander or commodore of CIMAR, the most enigmatic and fascinating villain I have ever encountered, a man named Keith Maxwell, who several sources told me always dressed in white. And that could either be Navy whites or medical whites, because he was running clinics in the townships outside of Joburg, doing weird experiments on black people, and he was not a doctor. And he was also extremely obsessed with HIV and AIDS. And there were, and still are, speculations about him and CIMAR actively trying to spread AIDS, which is the most controversial part of the film.
But just to be clear, you think this is all nonsense? Or not?
I still have my doubts about Maxwell and CIMAR. It has never been documented that they were actively spreading AIDS, but they were definitely making plans for it. Regarding Hammarskjöld, the jury is still out. The investigation is pending at the UN. A Tanzanian judge named Othman is spearheading the investigation. Their latest report, which is from this year, is leaning towards a conspiracy to kill Hammarskjöld. So do I, definitely. And also interesting, still, even today, the UK, South Africa, and the US refuses to release their records from back then on grounds of national security, or they are simply ignoring the United Nations.
I wonder what you both make of the label conspiracy theorist and how far you find it useful to deal with people of that kind. I'm sure you'd both agree, and most people here would, that there are many more conspiracy theories around, or at least more purveyors of bad information, and a rich sea of mistrust between elites and citizens, which make those theories more attractive. But on the other hand, the label conspiracy theory can be a very convenient way to smear and dismiss good, sometimes radical journalism. So first of all, it's a two-headed question to you both. What do you make of the label conspiracy theorist, and how far did you find those kind of people useful or simply a distraction in your work?
I mean, there is no doubt that being called a conspiracy theorist is toxic. I mean, it's an insult to journalists, and it's a very easy and quick way to try and dismiss you. I don't think I've ever been called. I mean, I'm sure I have been called on some forum, but conspiracy theories, because what I say is actually shocking. But you have to keep in mind that conspiracies do exist, right? I mean, they exist every day, everywhere. The definition of a conspiracy is just like, I think, two or more people plotting together to do something illegal. So, I mean, this is happening any moment. But the problem is conspiracy theorist is basically people imagining that there is a big plot out there. And what I did at the very beginning of my investigation, when from the journalism, because I didn't give you the next layers, basically I started with this assignment for Le Monde in 2014. And what we decided was 1 year later to revisit the story for the first anniversary. And that's when I started to understand that nothing was adding up. And I had probably dropped the story a bit too quickly, but at the same time, there was a lot going on in Hong Kong, as those who follow Asia would know, 2014. And so it's in revisiting the story 1 year later that I realized, no, none of what we had been told initially existed. And so I started by exploring all the conspiracy theories that had been handed out and that had been proliferating on the internet, because it's very interesting, you know, and when many people, millions, at least, I mean, possibly billion of people interested in that case, at least one of them would have figured it out. So you don't completely waste your time by looking at what people have made up.
And did you spend a lot of time on online fora?
No.
Okay.
No, because I don't have time to engage with that. But what happens is that eventually you do engage with people you trust, people, and then they kind of screen it for you. So sometime I would be made aware of an interesting hypothesis or an educated speaker on this or that forum. So I have kind of a filter, people almost screening this for me. But the beginning of my investigation, and I think it's probably the first or second chapter in the book, is going and looking at all the conspiracy theories, including that the plane wanted to attack Diego Garcia, of course, that the pilot was suicidal, and many others. And interestingly enough as well, each time you had a potential credible lead, example, the cargo, we very quickly heard that there was a problematic cargo in terms of mangosteen, 4 tons of mangosteen that would fill this room basically of this delicious fruit. But the fruit was out of season at the time, etc. And what's fantastic is that all the attention went on the mangosteen cargo. And what I found in the process of my investigation later on is that there was a problem with the cargo, but not that one. Another one, which was 2.5 tons of electronic cargo that was not documented. And every time there was one interesting potential lead that came up, I remember in the press conference, someone saying from Astro Awani, the Malaysian television, the guy said, we have just talked with a Chinese person who said that he received a text on the Kik messaging application from Philip Wood, the only American on board, at this time, 2 a.m., something like that, which was completely impossible and contradictory to the official narrative. And so, and they said, we identified the source, we talked with the guy, and he showed us the message. So that was very problematic. Immediately, you got a crazy story about the phone of Philip Wood that had been hidden in his bomb that sent a message from Diego Garcia. So, I mean, it's, yeah. But so you also see that what I mean is that you do see in these crazy theories, there is sometimes a reason for them, and you can't completely ignore them. There is, yeah, sometimes it's...
So, Mads, again, what do you make of the label conspiracy theorist, and how far did you find people like that useful or a distraction?
I have mixed feelings. First and foremost, it's the most easy way to cancel a journalist by labeling him or her a conspiracy theorist. regarding cold case Hammarskjöld, because supposedly Maxwell was doing research into spreading HIV through vaccines. That later on made me a darling with the anti-vaxxers. They are my people. But it's paradoxical because journalism is considered and can be and should be the antidote to conspiracy theory. And yet at the same time, there is some inherent conspiratorial by default in journalism as a practice. The founding mythos of modern journalism, All the President's Men, it's a story about a vast conspiracy that two journalists, by essentially pulling a thread, can bring down a president. It's an intoxicating narrative, which still haunts many journalists. And I think some of it has to do with conspiracy theory being enormously entertaining. And in some ways, a kind of, that's my relationship with it anyways, a kind of pornography for journalists. And if done rightly, it can be riveting, fascinating, and then afterwards you have you feel messy and depressed. But you know, some of the best conspiracy theorists out there, most of them being American, such as Peter Beater, James Shelby Downard, Jim Mars, for example, they display enormous creativity and are also sometimes good at finding small bits of information, connecting the dots. It's all about data points. In some sense, they can be read or consumed as working hypotheses. Sometimes they do discover interesting things. But of course, you have to tread carefully. But you also have to recognize that conspiracy theory is, you know, it used to belong to the fringes, but now it's beyond mainstream. Donald Trump is a major conspiracy theorist. So is RFK. Elon Musk has gone totally conspiracy theorist. So I think we need to, reconsider how we deal with this matter, essentially.
I mean, both of you tell a hell of a story, what some people might dismissively call a yarn. But that's no bad thing. I mean, I think we can all agree that investigative journalism badly needs to grip people, and these are gripping investigations. I wonder if either of you ever felt in the course of your work or in the lead up to your book, Florence, that it might be quite useful to flirt with conspiracy theories because it's a large audience?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I really don't see. I really don't see the point. What I'm working at is to find the truth. I mean, I'd like to say, and it's important because we've talked about, you know, silence before and people shrugging about what happens. But people need to figure out that a Boeing 777, it's not the MAX 737 that we've just heard, which was an unreliable plane. The Boeing 777 was kind of the safest plane of civil aviation history. With 239 people disappearing in the most monitored place, basically, of the planet, whether you consider that it's the South China Sea or whether you believe part of the official narrative and then it's in the Malacca Straits, is simply, I mean, they always said it's an incredible story. And CNN loved this incredible story. And that drives me mad. I say, it's not incredible at all. It is simply not credible. I mean, that's what it is. It is a not credible, not acceptable story that in 2014 when you can basically see an apple on the moon, and I mean a few years later we're live with Mars, we can lose a Boeing 777 and basically the audience of this room who have just gone, boom. And, and the debris later, completely unreliable. And what they do to make us swallow this, because I think all of us somewhere have a sense that that story does not add up. But it is so uncomfortable that we don't want to get into it, and we would like to reassure ourselves with the fake narrative that they regularly feed us with. So there is absolutely no attraction for me in any conspiracy, whatever. What I'm interested with is the truth, and the truth is only one. There is no alternative truth. Something very precise happened to that plane at a very precise moment, and 239 people and 10 tons of cargo. That's the only thing I'm interested about.
Do you want to come in on that, Mads, or not so much?
Well, regarding Hammarskjöld, I have an advantage which Florence does not. That there is a crash site. The wreckage is supposedly buried beneath the airport in Ndola. But doing journalism adhering to sound journalistic principles about a conspiracy theory can be enormously interesting and can take you places you wouldn't believe. Just going to visiting Ndola and going to the crash site and discovering by yourself how close it is to Ndola city and the airport makes you wonder and question the official narrative, which is that the plane crashed between midnight 18th and 19th of September 1961. There was an enormous fire, which it was a moonlit night, which must have been visible from basically, everywhere inside Ndola. Yet it took 15 hours officially before the crash site was discovered. That doesn't make sense, and that is where you begin when you want to unravel what happened with Dag Hammarskjöld.
I'm glad both of you mentioned the official narrative. The fact that the official story in all of these cases doesn't stand up or doesn't appear to stand up is often the kind of wormhole through which arcane conspiracy theories enter and flourish. Witness the case of 9/11. So I wonder, and this really gets to the heart of what investigative journalism is, I wonder, Florence, you first of all, is it enough for us to simply dismantle the official narrative, or do we have then an obligation to provide an alternative explanation for why something happened? Because otherwise, isn't there a danger?
Yeah.
Everything just collapses.
Yeah, but you have to start. I mean, the beginning is to double check the official narrative, and that's what I did initially. And I really thought, okay, we know the plane. Okay, we know basically it flew for 40 minutes. That's what we know, and it ends with the goodbye of the pilot. And then we are told it turned off its communication system, and then we are told it did a U-turn, and then we are told. So I took every one of these moments, and I really had a forensic study. And luckily in Hong Kong, where I live on a boat, and there are many Cathay pilots around me, and Cathay is one of the biggest purchaser of Boeing 777. So at the very beginning of my investigation, it was a bit technical. But people also have to realize, when pilots say, like, who am I? I'm not a pilot, I'm not a trainer. It's not my beat, like Dominic Gates said before. But actually, it's a very good thing that it's not my beat, because obviously disappearing a plane and 239 people has got nothing to do with being a pilot or with knowing anything about how you turn off your ARCAR system or your transponder. I lost the train of my thought now.
I think what you're saying is in some ways more interesting. It's about the relationship between technical expertise and going down that kind of rabbit hole versus what journalism is. Because the problem with many conspiracy theorists is that they seem to know a hell of a lot about very technical things. So are you saying something about the relationship between a certain kind of arcane technical expertise and what journalism should do in terms of finding the truth?
I mean, yeah, the beginning of the investigation had to be a little bit technical. Just to clarify, I remember now. Okay, so it was whether it was that I spent a lot of time just dismantling and disproving the official narrative. But that's the beginning. I mean, you can't start by saying, I know what happened or I think what happened. If the official narrative is fine, and I was going along with it at the very beginning, during my first assignment in 2014. But so you start by saying that there is nothing that holds up in the official narrative. A bit, I guess, like what you saw with your plane crash, except that it was 60 years ago and MH370 is only 10 years ago. And once you are absolutely convinced, it's not convinced, it's like it's there. And for anyone to pay attention to every document, every sources, and I think I make quite a strong case in the book, then of course you have to say, well, then what? But I also make the point that it's a bit much to ask a person like me, basically, a journalist running my own show, to come up with a completely satisfying explanation to what may have happened when you consider the size of the cover-up, when you consider the efforts that have been into making people believe that this plane crashed in the Southern Indian Ocean, including this ridiculous Australian search in the Southern Indian Ocean. When you look at it, I think I have a whole chapter about it. That is laughable. It's really almost a funny chapter, so ridiculous it is. So when you realize that they've put so much effort in the propaganda and in the promotion of the fake narrative, it's a bit much to ask me to come up just like that with a perfectly knitted version of the truth. But I think that with everything I put together, we already have a much better idea of what actually happened. And I mean, later if we talk about sources, there is a lot to say about that as well.
Mads, do we have, having dismantled an official narrative, do we have an obligation then to say what really happened?
I think if we know, that's a problem.
Ideally, if we do, yes. But the idea that you can fully explain and uncover what happened in an African country back in 1961, is in some sense ludicrous. Of course, you should try and do your best. It's also, you shouldn't forget, it's exciting working as a journalist with conspiracy theories, because if you have a fetish for being paranoid, it's absolutely wonderful. Mm-hmm. In the beginning, I was researching one of the schools of Dag Hammarskjöld claims that it was the Russians. The American spy master James Jesus Angleton was peddling this narrative to American journalists. So I went to Moscow trying to locate the interpreter of Khrushchev, who was still alive. Sukhodrev is his name. And finally I had his phone number and called him up. And he spoke this, as Russian interpreters from the Cold War did back then, perfect Oxford English, like, good morning. And then he said, Khrushchev basically didn't speak about Hammarskjöld's death at all. And I said, but could it be because he had some knowledge which was confidential? Then he said he simply didn't really care about it. It was just another day at the office. Then I asked, would you meet with me tomorrow? I would like, to ask some more questions and meet you in person. And then he said, no, I have a cold, which I took as a way of brushing me off. Then next morning, I turn on Russian television. I don't understand Russian really much at all. But there is a story about Sukhodev is dead. So he passed away between I spoke with him and then the next morning he's dead. And I'm thinking, wow, what have I done? That was a very interesting moment.
We only have 13 minutes left, so I think I've taken up enough of the time, and I should solicit some questions from the audience. Seems to be a rumble of interest at the back there. Jake, let's see who we have in terms of questions and who would like to ask them. Or you're welcome to find someone yourself, Jake. So if you try and keep your question as concise as possible, because we really can't, we only have time for about 3 questions, I would say. This gentleman.
Hi, I'll try to be very quick. My name is Jake. I'm from Big Brother Watch, the organisation who's done a lot of work on the UK's counter-disinformation units. We were called Conspiracy Theorists by Ben Wallace for our work. But basically, you want to ask the panel, do you think the label disinformation has been politicised and people's fear of being called a disinformation agent is undermining independent journalism and investigative journalism because people are now fear I can ask these questions and pushing the envelope and being called out by certain organisations online for being disinformation agents? And do we think we should be much freer to ask these questions and see where the truth takes us rather than being scared of, again, certain organisations and certain BBC units calling you out for spreading misinformation when you're just trying to find out the truth?
Interesting. Florence?
I really don't care what I could be called. I think I do my job, and I'm lucky enough to be old enough with a pretty long record, like 30 years in journalism.
But what do you make of the contemporary use of the word disinformation?
I thought it was disinformation agent to us.
Oh, yeah.
Well, disinformation is a massive problem. It's even, I would say, more than disinformation, it's information chaos. It's a bit like, truth and lie. Truth and lie is still okay because you have a reference, which is truth, but bullshit becomes very problematic. And I think now we are in this era, I mean, Trump kind of started it 10 years ago, of this bullshit and of this information chaos. So, yeah, it's a huge problem.
Mads, what do you make of the contemporary label disinformation, and is it a way of shutting people down or censoring them?
I think it goes a long way back. Actually, regarding South Africa, they were spending enormous amounts of rands on, you can call it misinformation or disinformation. They would call it Stratcom, strategic information. The Bureau of Civil Cooperation was running enormous operations regarding winning the hearts and minds of South Africans, running psyops abroad. They were running a newspaper in Morocco, I remember reading, and a news agency in Europe. And parts of this activity is still with us because it became ingrained in reality and is now today perceived as facts. It is not.
But I think the distinction that the question was making, that back in the 1970s and 1980s, we would refer to disinformation in its use by states. Now, increasingly, disinformation is used to refer to what some ordinary people might think, and to shut that down.
We would earlier on, people would speak about psychological operations, propaganda, and so on. Now it is used as a way of, canceling people we do not like, or it's. I think it's a tricky. You know, it's a tricky topic, just as conspiracy theory is. Yeah.
If I can just say, I think it requires enormous and new education. People really need to be basically trained in disinformation to spot it. And since I worked on this thing, I discovered, that the world is full of cover-ups indeed, and of planted evidence, etc. And now I'm much better at spotting them. But I wasn't 10 years ago.
I always say that in Ireland we only have two different kinds of disinformation and that information. Jake.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking. And I'd love to ask you about the siloed ways that viewers and readers are consuming news and this confirmation bias that I think a lot of folks have because you have a finite amount of time and journalism is not valued as highly, it seems, especially after the first term under President Trump. And as we come into a second administration, I'd love to kind of have an idea of your perspectives as disinformation, conspiracies, all of these things become even more mainstream because you're hearing them from the highest offices in some countries.
Who would like to? Florence?
Well, maybe just briefly, the story at the beginning, the official story, there was a scoop. It all started with a scoop by the Wall Street Journal, and that who was the first one to say that the plane did a U-turn. And for a few hours, this official narrative was hanging in the air because CNN immediately contested it and said, that's not true. Our best sources are saying that the plane did not continue to fly for several hours. In the meantime, later I also got an email saying from Malaysian Airlines, internal email, confidential, writing to a lawyer of one of the family, saying as far as the information by Wall Street Journal saying that the plane turned based on Boeing and Rolls-Royce sources is false. It was written in big letters. So for a while, the new narrative, which is going to become the official narrative and still stand today, was hanging. What happened? Press conference at the White House endorsing the Wall Street Journal scoop. What can you do against that? Nothing. It's done. The official narrative is officially christened. It has the backing of the White House. You cannot discuss it anymore. And me at the time, I can't believe I was so naive 10 years ago, but you kind of go along with it. If it has been blessed, if an information that was, at least it's our thinking, but it's true that in this new era, you have to even contest or question a scoop by very established newspaper. That's one thing I think many people have learned to do now. But also statements by the biggest government in the world. By now it seems so obvious that you should question, but yeah.
All societies or cultures, countries have blind angles, things which are left uncovered, which we do not speak about. In Denmark, it's Nord Stream, which happened. It happened in Danish waters, right next to the island of Bornholm. Even today, two years later, the official position of the Danish government is, we really don't know what happened. Yeah. They did Danish police did what you could call a cosmetic investigation, and then it was closed down. And but now it's an embarrassment because Wall Street Journal published a very fact-checked, very thorough investigation of what happened. It is not, really talked about in Denmark. And I think, this is what makes people uncomfortable about journalism. When things that important is left, untouched.
Another question. Who do we see? Who has?
I've got a microphone. So there.
Peter York's just grabbed the mic for his own purposes. So Briefly, Peter.
2 riveting books, obviously, and I long to read them, but about the official narrative that you've described, who in fact was the author of that official narrative? Who was the mouthpiece and then the secondary mouthpiece, and why? What was the point of it? Why did they produce this story? To distract people? To drive them mad?
Florence.
Well, obviously to just cover the truth, which is not uncovered yet. So who? Well, it started with this scoop of the Wall Street Journal, and I talked to the people, the 2 journalists, very good journalists, by the way. And, I thought of this yesterday because someone said, well, it's one of my very good sources. Warning, be very careful with your very good sources, because especially in industries like, pharmaceutical or aerospace or something, they are your very good sources until the day they basically feed you a false information. So it started like that. It was confirmed by the White House. And then you had a UK company that came in with its special data that no one could double check, that kind of double confirmed that the plane was down there. And in the meantime, you had a big circus by the Australian, etc. So it's been a story made of several beats.
Well, we have time for one more question, which has to be short and concise and in the form of a question. And this gentleman.
Hi, yeah, thank you. So just very quickly, I work in the aerospace industry. I've worked there for 13 years, and I really, do support, Florence's, perspectives of the official narrative being a total lie. I mean, I would like to, really just ask, Florence around her perspective on the, heavily reports in the media around the, new search, which is, happening, planning to be around Australia. So there's been 2 searches, obviously one by Ocean Infinity on an obviously no fine, no fee basis, and there's going to be another one as well, which according to me is like a massive insult to the families and like a great, obviously waste of time and resources. So I'd just like to ask, Florence of her perspective of this new search which is rumored in the media.
Okay.
Thank you, Florence.
Yeah, well, basically, because I'm completely sure that the plane did not crash in the Southern Indian Ocean, I obviously think that it's a waste of time and money to keep searching there. Having said that, I don't mind, because the more they search, the more they prove that it was never there. But I'm getting a little bit worried because, as I told you, the propaganda is so powerful, and they have. Recently, there was a new scientist. I mean, every 3 to 6 months, you have a new expert kind of scientist, and really these scientists that come up with this story, sometimes they're very, very dubious. But he came up with exactly what I was dreading, which is the hypothesis that the plane crashed in the Southern Indian Ocean, because all the news stories you see about it have 2 constants. 1, the Southern Indian Ocean. 2, the culprit is the pilot somehow. Now, the latest one is that the plane crashed, yes, in the Southern Indian Ocean, but very close to an even deeper ridge or pit, so that if ever we find a little bit of the plane, we won't be able to find all of it. And so now that they're restarting the search with super sophisticated means, I would be terrified to think that they could produce even an engine or even the black box and would take the public opinion for an even bigger ride by saying, sorry about the rest of it because it's down the pit. And I was very happy that CNN, I think by accident, invited me live. So live is great on TV. Everything else is dangerous. But for the 10th anniversary, and they asked me about that. And I was able to say, look, the only acceptable and credible evidence that the plane crashed in the Southern Indian Ocean is if we find a field of debris. And we have a benchmark for that. In June 2009, AF447 flying between Rio and Paris crashed in the Atlantic. Took 2 years to find the field of debris at the bottom, but very interestingly enough, similar kind of depth, 5,000 meters. And so we know what it looks like. In recent days, a field of debris, you basically recover 90% of your plane within a square kilometer. So just finding even an engine, a piece of whatever, won't do. And please, if ever in the coming month they come up by, we finally found the engine or something, and unfortunately everything else is down there and it's unreachable, don't fall for it.
I think we should leave it there. So thank you for a thrillingly open and utterly gripping discussion, Florence Changy and Mads Brugger. Thank you.